if you build it. It took me many years to get over what happened that Christmas. To be honest, I'm not sure I ever really have. The nightmares still come from time to time, 40 years after it happened. And I never can see a snowman without a stab of ice-cold fear in my heart. It happened back when I was a kid, in the winter of '79, which was one of the coldest on record. I would have been 8 years old then. My parents had rented this quaint chocolate box cottage in the Highlands of Scotland for the Christmas holidays. After all these years, my memory of the place is a little foggy. I forget the name of it. I just have this vague picture in my mind of a secluded little snowbound village clinging to the slopes of a narrow valley between lofty mountain peaks. We'd driven all the way up from Bristol that day. My dad said it was Christmas Eve. I spent it sprawled listlessly on the back seat of my parents' Volvo as the time ticked away. 12 hours of monotonous motorways, listening to the tyres roar along the asphalt. I was in purgatory, my head lolling apathetically despite the exciting prospect of Christmas, gazing blankly at the repetitive grey countryside whirling past the side window, sucking extra strong mints to alleviate my travel sickness. As the sky began to darken, we left the motorway and struck out across a bleak hill country, heading ever northward. In the distance I remember black mountains veiled in the mist in the gathering twilight. At some point I must have drifted off, the hum of the engine and the low murmur of my parents' conversation lulling me to sleep. I remember waking up to the sound of the snow crunching beneath our tyres, my dad tentatively urging the car down the narrow lane that led to the cottage where we were to spend Christmas. It was dark now, and I was groggy and disorientated, uncertain where I was. Inside the confines of the car, it was hot and close, but outside, beyond the soft yellow glow of the headlights, shadowy forms loomed out of the snow and the shadows. I watched apprehensively as the blank silhouettes of trees and the buildings of the village slid past us and away into the night. We were met at Pennant's cottage by the holiday company representative. I never knew her name, and don't remember much about her at all, except that she was flustered and very anxious to leave. Foregoing the formality of showing us around, she laid the keys to the cottage in my bewildered father's hand, hurriedly explaining that she had a long journey ahead through the snow and didn't want to get stuck. After that, she disappeared into the night. Kicking the snow from our shoes and venturing inside the cottage, we were pleased to find that she had lit the log fire in the sitting room, and it was warm and bright in there under the low oak beams. There was even a Christmas tree, its multicoloured fairy lights glittering in the bay window. In the kitchen, the Argo was warm, and a copper kettle was simmering gently on the hot plate. All in all, it was a welcoming little place, and I recall going to bed quite contentedly after dinner that first night, with Jeremy, my favourite teddy, tucked in beside me under the blankets. The next morning was Christmas Eve. After breakfast, we took a short walk into the village, to the general store for a few essential supplies. The sky overhead was heavy with snow clouds, but the lights glowed warmly in the windows of the little cluster of houses, and all the countryside around was blanketed in a thick fall of snow, painting a scene of Christmas card nostalgia. In the afternoon, after returning to the cottage, Mum and Dad and I ventured out to play in the snow. I remember we had a snowball fight that, looking back now, I suspect my dad let me win. After that, Mum went back inside, and me and my dad set about building a snowman in the front garden, near the gate. It wasn't a very big snowman, but I was proud of him. He looked so friendly. We gave him twigs for arms, 2 choice lumps of coal from the bunker for eyes, and a fresh carrot for a nose. My dad was helping me wind his scarf around the snowman's neck, when we were surprised by a child's voice. "You shouldn't be doing that," they said, matter-of-factly. Startled, I looked up, to see 3 sullen children, thickly wrapped in winter coats and woolen hats, watching us from over the garden wall. "What's that?" asked my dad in good humour. "The snowman," said the taller of the 2 boys. "We don't make them around here. It's not allowed." My dad shot me a quizzical look. "Oh really?" he said, returning his attention to the newcomers with a broad smile. "And who says so?" he challenged, with a sly wink to me. "I do," came a coarse reply from some way off. A dark shape was approaching from further up the lane. It was an old man, his boots crunching through the snow. He was wire-thin, and to my eyes, very old and very wrinkly, but he walked with purpose. Beside him, on a long lead, loped a fractious-looking German shepherd. The old man came to a halt beside the children, placing a protective hand on the shoulder of the girl. At sight of our snowman, the dog let out a low, threatening growl that quickly developed into a vicious gust of barking. The old man calmed the beast, stroking its head with affection, but his hard eyes never left us. He studied us in silence for a space, before he spoke again. "You're English," he said, in a thick Highland accent, and casually spat into the snow. "Here for the Yuletide, are ye?" he inquired gruffly, but went on without waiting for a reply. "What you do down south is your own business. But while you're here, you'll do well to heed what I say." His arm shot out abruptly, a bony finger levelled at our freshly built snowman. "We don't do that here. Kindly take it down." My dad snorted, his genial smile broadening into a grin of genuine amusement. "It's just a snowman," he said. The old man's lips tightened, his eyes fixed on my dad. He took a step toward us, and with him came a stifling sense of claustrophobia, his eyes conveying a peculiar haunting intensity. "I said take it down," he whispered. "It's dangerous." "Don't be daft," my dad scoffed. "It's only a bloody snowman." The old man dropped his eyes, glancing about him, as though uncertain. I remember him making an odd flourishing motion with his left hand, that ended in a cryptic sign. He scratched his bristled chin, pondering. It was clear, looking back, that a conflict raged within him. Then, with sudden resolve, he returned his gaze to us with a stark and cryptic warning. "If you don't take it down, they will come for you." As he spoke, his eyes were locked onto my father's with unnerving severity. Everyone fell silent at that. I wasn't sure what to make of it, and I'm pretty sure my dad was as confused as I was. We all stood there in silence, that pregnant pause stretching out for several seconds before the old man turned in silence and strode away without another word. And the children followed him. I listened as my parents discussed that strange encounter over dinner. My dad seemed amused at the whole thing, laughing it off when I asked him why the old man told us not to make a snowman. He explained it away in good humour, putting it all down to the backward superstitions of the local village folk. It was either that, he claimed, as he poured the wine, or a silly stunt intended to frighten us. My mum took a grave and altogether more serious view of the matter, expressing her concern that we ought not deliberately antagonise the local people, that we were guests here for the holidays, and that it was only polite to observe the local customs even though they might seem peculiar to us. She went on to suggest that we comply with their request, but my father was having none of it, and scoffed at the notion of paying lip service to such colloquial superstitions. As far as he was concerned, the whole thing was ridiculous. It was only when dinner was over, and I asked to leave the table, that, looking out of the bay window of the sitting room, the one that overlooked the front garden, I discovered that our snowman had been knocked down. All that remained of it was a shallow hump of snow, and my father's scarf lying discarded on the ground beside it. My dad went out to retrieve it, while my mother and I stood in the doorway, my breath freezing in the chill air. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, coming down in fat flakes that drifted slowly to earth out of the low mist overhead. From what he could see through the mist, there was no one about. The lane running past the cottage was desolate of human traffic, and eerily silent, the kind of dead silence you only get at night, when the mist rolls in, and the snow lays thick on the ground. There was no sign of who or what might have knocked over our snowman. There wasn't even any sign of footprints. Whoever it was, they must be long gone. My dad explained that it was meant to be a prank, played by the children we had met that afternoon, and promised that we'd make another the following morning after opening our presents. I thought little of it after that for the rest of the evening, preoccupied as we were with all the preparations for Christmas Day. That night, before I went to bed, we left a glass of sherry and a mince pie on the mantelpiece for Santa, along with a carrot for Rudolph. I remember insisting that we put the fire out, anxious that Santa wouldn't be able to come down the chimney with it lit, but my dad allayed my concerns, promising me that he'd make sure it was out before they went to bed that night. Content with that explanation, I went off to bed, and was soon dreaming of reindeer and presents and snowmen. With all the excitement of Christmas morning, our odd encounter, and the puzzle of the broken snowman had entirely slipped my mind. The log fire was crackling in the grate as my parents and I gathered around the tree to open our presents. I'll admit I was spoilt that Christmas. I can't even remember half of what I got that year. The only present that sticks out clearly in my mind was a game called Hungry Hippos. It's hectic fun, but it's pretty basic, and I soon got bored of it. And as my mum went off to start work on cooking Christmas dinner, I moved on to explore the rest of my haul of presents. I heard the snick of a lighter as my dad lit a cigarette, wandering over to the window. "Lynn," he said after a space. "Lynn, come and look at this." I heard my dad's voice, but had paid him no mind as he called my mum out of the kitchen. Occupied as I was with my toys, I scarcely noticed as she walked through to join him before the window. "Well, what do you make of that?" he said doubtfully. "It must be those local kids," she concluded in a bemused tone. My curiosity piqued. I joined them at the window, a Hot Wheels car held in one hand. Several snowmen stood in the garden outside. They were larger than the one Dad and I had built the day before, bigger than me, perhaps even bigger than my dad. As I studied them through the glass, I decided I didn't like them. Indeed, there was something unsettling about them. There was something sinister and unnervingly lifelike about their posture, something worrisome about the crudely formed expressions on their faces. No, I didn't like them one bit. I said as much to my mum, but she smiled and tousled my hair and told me it was nothing to worry about. "It's just those local kids playing about trying to scare us," said my dad. "We won't let those silly kids scare us, will we, mate?" I shook my head, smiling weakly, but that odd look of apprehension exchanged between my parents was not lost on me. The mood over the dinner table was subdued. That odd reception from the locals, the deliberate destruction of my snowman, and now this, had all combined to take the shine off our Christmas festivities, and we were left rather flat. Our stilted conversation was diffused by long silences. Looking back, each of us seemed busy with our own private thoughts and speculations. With the turkey dinner finished, hot Christmas pudding followed, with double cream, and after the crackers were pulled, my parents and I retired to the sitting room, where I resumed work on a Lego set, while my parents both drifted off to sleep on the big sofa. It was warm and quiet under the low oak beams, the gentle crackling of the fire in the grate, the big clock on the mantel ticking away the seconds, and the low murmur of the television set, all combined to form a soothing backdrop to my play. It was some time before I noticed a faint scratching on the panes of the bay window, and looking up, it took me a second to work out exactly what that round shape was framed in the glass. I'm not certain what happened next. I might have screamed. I might have called for my mum. Either way, the next thing I knew, my parents were awake and off the sofa, my mother kneeling beside me on the floor, cuddling me, while my dad stared in disbelief through the window at the sinister face of the snowman that looked, for all the world, as though it were peering in, watching us through the sitting room window. The snowmen we had seen earlier had been joined by more, and now, beyond the eerie face in the window, I could see the garden was littered with towering figures. Each was uniquely hideous, and each seemed frozen in the midst of movement as they advanced on the cottage, as though petrified in place by our gaze. I'll admit I was frightened at that moment, but that was nothing compared to what came later. "I've had just about enough of this," snarled my dad, pulling on his boots and coat in the narrow hallway. He disappeared outside, closing the front door behind him with a slam, and a minute later we saw him in the front garden, methodically smashing them down one by one with a garden spade. 10 minutes later he was back, red-faced and sweating, with a grimly satisfied look on his face. "Smashed a lot of them," he scowled. "I'm going to call the holiday people about this," my mum said angrily, helping him out of his coat and hanging it over the newel post. She flitted away into the kitchen, and I could hear the swish and whir of the rotary dial turning as she picked out the numbers in sequence on the telephone. "The line's dead," she said flatly, after listening to the dead tone for several seconds, the receiver still hanging limply in her hand. Dad and I had joined her in the kitchen. He filled the kettle from the tap and set it on the hot plate. "Let's not panic," he smiled. I'm sure it's just the local kids having a laugh at our expense.
That's as maybe, but it's not on,
Mum replied sourly. I know, love, he said, holding her, as I stood by watching them. But there's not much we can do about it now. Let's not let them ruin Christmas, eh? He implored, with his best winning smile. She nodded, her lips pursed, and laid her head on his chest, while I gazed out of the kitchen window into the snowflecked darkness beyond the glass. Later that evening, they were back. How they came to be there, I don't know. We'd been watching the telly in the sitting room all evening, my parents munching cheese and biscuits, while I worked my way through my selection box of Cadbury's chocolates, each of us, in our way, trying to put the mysterious events of the day out of our minds and enjoy ourselves. We hadn't heard any movement outside in the garden, yet there they were, a shadowy line of snowy figures half hidden in the drooping mist at the edge of the garden. My dad wanted to go out and confront whoever was out there, but my mum held his arm.
Leave it, John, she urged. There's no sense in antagonising them further. They're obviously unhinged. It's getting late. Let's just lock up for the night. We can pack up and leave early in the morning.
He was full of pent-up rage, but he could see the sense of what she'd said, and in the end he relented, insisting that he would stay up all night and keep watch. I was sent to bed an hour later, my dad calling after me, wishing me a good night. He usually came up to tuck me in, but not this time. Instead, he remained in the sitting room, anxiously gazing out of the window, with the garden spade propped up against the chair beside him. Mum came up with me though, and I remember her reading to me. It was a long time before I drifted off to sleep. I was startled out of worrisome dreams by a drip of ice-cold water on my nose. I felt a shiver run through me. I blinked and opened my eyes in the darkness. My room was freezing cold, where it had been warm and cosy when I'd fallen asleep. I shivered again. Above me, a paler shape emerged out of the gloom as my eyes adjusted to the dark. I remember staring fixedly at it, unable to tear my eyes away. I twitched as another icy drip touched my cheek. Where had it come from? Switch on the light, I thought, my right hand creeping slowly, as though fearful of drawing the attention of a predatory beast out from beneath the blankets, my small fingers questing for the switch of the lamp I knew was standing on my bedside table. The light came on with a click, and a soft yellow glow flooded my little corner of the room. I saw it then. The Snowman. It was stood beside my bed, a great tower of compacted snow jutting up from the floor and looming impossibly over me. Its contorted face was now pressed mere inches from my own, a ragged mouth of icy, chisel-like teeth gaping wide above my throat, burning blackened pits for eyes, mesmerising eyes that danced with a glimmer of light, eyes that seemed to swallow me up into the endless black void that called to me from within their depths. I may have screamed then. I can't remember. In truth, I can't remember anything after that. I can't remember anything else until I woke up in the children's ward at the hospital in Perth. That was 2 days later. The hospital staff were at a loss, even as to who I was, and I had to sit through hours of interviews with weary, concerned-looking social workers and with the police, when all I wanted was to see my parents. Later I was told that I'd been brought into the hospital by an old man. The man had left without leaving his name. A week later, our abandoned Volvo was reported to the police by the holiday rep. Upon further investigation, my parents were found at the holiday cottage, huddled together, dead and blackened, and inexplicably frostbitten.